I too want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking on tonight, and the panel and I are conversing, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I think it feels especially important to acknowledge country when we're having a conversation tonight about queer history and archives, because the story of LGBTQ activism in Australia is the story of coalition and collectivism and inspiration from other movements, including First Nations resistance, sovereignty and community organising. Across the materials held in libraries like the State Library, the ephemera, newsletters, posters, minutes and personal papers that highlight the amazing creativity and energy of LGBTQ plus activism, particularly in Australia in the 70s, 80s and onwards, shows that cross coalition and overlap with these other liberation struggles. These are not parallel histories, they are intertwined, and this is something that we can trace when we look through the archival collections of queer history too. So before we begin, I just want to give a quick shout out to our wonderful guest virtual scribe, Emma Rowland, who's basically a virtual scribe extraordinaire. She's going to create a visual illustration of tonight's discussion and the key points and work her magic on the screen behind us. So Emma's scribing will take place throughout the conversation and you'll be able to see it being formed behind us. So we're really, really grateful to have Emma with us tonight scribing. Also, if you have a question that strikes you, something you want to add or ask about during tonight's discussion, please go to the link at the top of the screen, slido.com. This is where you can submit your questions, and then at the end of the discussion, if we have time, we'll aim to answer some of them, or the panelists will aim to answer some of them. So, in preparing for tonight, I found myself wondering how many other Pride Month events in Australia and elsewhere, including overseas, were centring queer archives and queer histories in the way that this was. I know that interest has been growing in this area. It's something I've uniquely noticed, but I wasn't prepared for the scale of what I found. I'm one of those people in my friendship groups that is obsessed with archives and libraries, but that is not usually a shared feeling or hobby. So I was just interested to see what others were feeling about queer archives, particularly in Pride Month. And I fell into a rabbit hole of event listings and social posts from across Australia, but in particular around the world. Panels, workshops, readings, community archiving days, film screenings at libraries and roundtables, all explicitly focused on queer archives and queer stories, and the relationship in particular between community, advocacy and public institutions, particularly libraries. So different places, different communities, different histories throughout the world. I found workshops in Australia, New Zealand, across the UK, programs also emerging in the United States, including in southern states where holding queer archives at the moment is particularly contentious and challenged. Pride Month screenings in library collections in regional areas of countries in Europe and North America. Queer folk song archives and performances at Exeter Library in England. Indigenous queer stories being preserved and shared across Canadian libraries as well. So it was really amazing to see that breadth of interest worldwide. And I think this speaks to how public libraries have become, or perhaps they've always been, really interesting dynamic spaces for queer culture, queer storytelling, and obviously archiving and ensuring our lives and histories are kept on the historical record. And I think State Library of New South Wales is one such place where that's been really unique and something that I've personally benefited from through my own research, but something that the three panellists tonight are going to speak to in their unique roles within the library, their relationship to the library and the queer collections. So we're really lucky to have these three experts and their expert insights. So please, first let's welcome Margy Burn, AM. Margy headed... Yes. Margy headed Australiana collections at the State Libraries of South Australia, New South Wales and the National Library of Australia. Across her long career, she is known for her commitment to building more diverse collections and ensuring stronger representation of women culturally diverse communities and Indigenous Australians. As Mitchell Librarian in the State Library of New South Wales, Margy established the library's oral history collection and pioneered the acquisition of material documenting the experiences of people living with HIV/AIDS. It's also worth noting Margy's got her own oral history interview deposited here at the archive, which I listened to in prep for this night, interviewed by Bruce Carter. It's a great interview, a great listen, and she goes through some of the milestones and shifts in the library's culture and the way that it's dealt with and housed queer archives. So we're really lucky to have Margy with us tonight. We'll also have Bruce Carter in the middle. Welcome, Bruce.
Hi, folks.
Bruce is a legend. Bruce has worked with communities on history projects for more than 25 years, and for 15 years has collaborated closely with researchers at the State Library of New South Wales and their queer archival collections. He was also a founding member of Sydney's Pride History Group in 2006. It was a group I joined in 2013, so thanks for starting that group, Bruce. And it's been a really critical community-run history-focused space and integral in safeguarding queer storytelling and oral histories. Bruce also served as co-curator on the library's Coming Out in the 70s exhibition and Pride Revolution in 2023. Bruce's advocacy has been central to several major exhibitions, and just his deep knowledge of the archives and particular support for queer archives is really immense. So lucky to have Bruce here tonight too. And last but not least, please welcome Sam Cooling with the best hair I've ever seen. Sam has worked as a queer librarian at the State Library of New South Wales since 2023. With a background in archaeology and heritage studies, Sam brings a strong commitment to preserving materials that document New South Wales LGBTQIA+ and other minority communities. Their essay on the queer history of Pix magazine appears in the autumn 2026 issue of Open Book, so check that out. Sam arrived at the library at a particularly significant cultural moment for Sydney, coinciding with World Pride and the library's Pride Revolution exhibition. Sam brings a remarkable depth of archival insight as well as thoughtful reflections on what it means to be a visible queer expert, pioneering queer collections, I think, as well within a library setting. So welcome, Sam, and welcome again to everybody here tonight. Let's jump right in with some origin stories and the relationship of the library to each of you. Also, the library itself has undertaken some really groundbreaking work over the years, and particularly recently in collecting, preserving and exhibiting queer archives, so particular ephemera materials within the library related to queer lives, communities, ideas and activism over the years, including intergenerational oral histories, which is amazing to see. When did each of you first start to notice this shift in the more intentional and consistent collecting and archiving and also visibility of these queer materials here at the State Library of New South Wales? And alongside that, what's your own origin story with the library and where did you come into it?
Well, perhaps I'll start. I became Mitchell Librarian in 1988, and so I was heading the Australiana collections. And I'd moved from Adelaide, and I'd known quite a lot of gay men in Adelaide, as well as lesbians. That's at the time, it's at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So my work actively collecting material was very much around the archives and the records of people living with HIV/AIDS. And although, of course, gay men weren't the only people living with HIV/AIDS, and I mean the timing is that the first AIDS case in Australia was reported in 82, the first death was 83, the AIDS Council of New South Wales was established in 85, so just a few years after, before I started working here. And it was a moment in history. I mean, the work of library building is thinking about what matters today, what's going to matter in the future. But that was, just an extraordinary time to be living in, a horrible time to be living in. When Sydney, the most gay city in Australia, I think, was so badly affected. And I mean, the thing about gay men was that they were activists. So some of the other groups that were impacted by HIV/AIDS were not so visible or not so active. And I was in a position where, because I had some connections in the community, I knew I had friends that I'd known, or people knew me through the networks that I'd been part of in Adelaide. I was sort of well positioned. And of course, in your work in these kind of collections, you get to know researchers. And so I got to know people like the historian Gary Wotherspoon, who was a heavy user of the Mitchell Library, Robert French, who was an archivist working in state records, but a great advocate for history. He had a regular column in the Star Observer. So the real pivotal moment, though, was the death of Peter Tully. Peter died in August 1992, and he died in Paris. He'd gone to see an exhibition, and he died intestate, without a will. Although he and his very close friend David McDermott, David said later, had had many conversations about wills, and within 7 days of Peter's death, his birth family came and took away all the things from the home he shared with David. So it was a shocking incident. It wasn't unusual. You know, there were many instances of funerals held at which the gay family were not welcome and were deliberately excluded. But perhaps it was the most high-profile example of that. And it really activated David to start advocating for estate planning for artists. He was also an artist. And so on World AIDS Day in 1992, David and I spoke at an event at the Gunnery that was organised by the Arts Law Centre about estate planning in David's case, and I spoke about the role of the library in wanting to preserve the records of people living with HIV/AIDS. And we started actively collecting. We started with a lot of photographs. They're the things that were most visible, I guess, and very easy. But it's like a ripple in a pond. Once it's known that the library was interested, once we had established the kind of relationships and built visibility, placing ourselves fairly and squarely in community events, things just kept coming in. And so that was my sort of origin story in terms of queer collecting here. And I think probably, as I say, most of what I personally was involved in was around gay men and the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I did also acquire lesbian material. In fact, I'm currently still working on the papers of the artist Vivienne Binns, whose archive I acquired for the Mitchell Library decades ago, and I'm just packing up the last of the boxes, Vivienne having moved into aged care. So, but yeah, my origin story is really centred around the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Thanks, Margy. What about you, Bruce? Similar timeline? No?
Yeah, no, well, I came to the library, State Library 15 years ago, but I started working with history 10 years before that. And HIV is very much why I'm here today as well, because I went through a period where I had to reevaluate my life. And so that started a long period studying and requalifying. And I knew I wanted to work with history. And I was like thinking, oh, how can I be pragmatic about this? I need a job, you know, I need to make a living. How can I work with history and, you know, get a job? So I did a library and archives course. I did Australian history, social history at UTS. And then I came here in 2010 and was working in the reading rooms, which is always a great place to get to know the State Library, because you get to see what people are using, what collections people are using, and what they're working on. You get to talk to researchers quite a bit. And then a few years down the track, we were asked to do we acquired the papers of Lex Watson, who some people here would know. Lex was a member of Camp New South Wales, and then Gay Liberation, 1972, 1973, then an activist right through into law reform, decriminalisation, very heavily involved in the gay rights lobby in the 1980s. We acquired his papers after his death. A very large collection, incredible collection, and Robert French had organised them. Robert French, that Margy just mentioned, who was an archivist and worked for many years at State Archives and National Archives as well. He organised them beautifully, and he suggested to the library, proposed to the library, that we do a show, and that became Coming Out in the 70s, which I did with, worked on with Margot Riley and Ronald Briggs and myself. During COVID, during lockdown, we were coming in here down in the stacks, going through all of the collections, those amazing collections that were collected during Margy's time in the 80s and 90s. And we had so much stuff, but we got a good show together that kind of covered 1970 to sort of about 1977. And the response was quite amazing. We have an online component to that show. We're very fortunate the web team were able to do an online exhibition for that show as well. And I think within the first 12 months it had had like 180,000 hits. It's still up there. It's still looked at a lot. If people don't know it, take a look. Coming Out in the 70s on the library website. And after that show, there was impetus. People were like, we didn't know you had all this material. We didn't know the State Library did things like this. So we thought, okay, we'll do a show for World Pride in 2023. And I worked on that with an amazing team of people. It was a hard show to work on because there was so much to cover. You know, we were trying to make a lot of people, we wanted people to be happy, we wanted people to be represented, and there was a lot of lively discussion and stuff like that. And I always said with that show, my idea of success would be that we had a place to dance and to laugh, but also a place to cry. And I think we got that with Pride Revolution, and people loved it. And I think it touched a whole lot of people.
100%. That was an amazing exhibition and worth all the effort and chaos and dynamics and everything that goes with a queer exhibition. But that's so interesting what you mentioned about the trajectory up to the Pride Revolution, the Pride Coming Out in the 70s exhibition and Lex Watson's papers, because I think in that story too is the immense personal effort that Robert and others in the community go through in making sure the archives of certain people and key figures or people that have had such a key involvement aren't lost. And I know that Robert, he would come to meetings that I was a part of as well after being at Lex Watson's house, after divvying up this immense archive in Lex's home, and just it was like a living museum inside Lex's home, and it required a lot of personal, physical immersion in that archive to ensure that it got to where it landed and what inspired an exhibition out of it. So it's quite incredible. Sam, not to be ageist, but came at a different time. You're sort of, you're sort of new wave of queerbrarians. What's your story with the library and where does it fit with, these kinds of exhibitions and archives?
Yeah, well, actually, I was loving the progression of the story here, because Bruce's introduction there to Pride Revolution, that is when I come in. I started literally the day after the Mardi Gras parade in World Pride. Was my first day at the library. Needless to say, that was maybe not the wisest choice, but we got through it. As Sophie mentioned, so I come from a background, so this is a career change for me. I come from a background of history, archaeology, heritage, and then the threads through, similarly to Bruce, I'd gotten to a point with that I wanted to be doing things I was passionate about, but I wanted to be on the other side of it. I wanted to be doing connected to that history, but not from the position I was at. So I was lucky. I decided to retrain, do my graduate diploma in library and information studies, and I was lucky enough to get a job here as my first library job. And the first day I walked in and I thought, gosh, all right, I'd researched here before and just kind of squirreled in the corners and someone would run on the back out thinking, oh gosh, look at this, is all so fancy and I'm this blue-haired trans person, what am I gonna do? The first day I walked in, I literally was met by rainbows everywhere. The lift was a pride flag. And I thought, maybe maybe I am special enough to be here, you know, or maybe we don't have to be special, maybe actually we can all take up space here. And it really shifted my perspective on what I thought of this place, or what I had, my preconceived notions before. And then as I started working with everyone, looking at our collections, and I realized, wow, I mean, there are so many queers in this place, currently and historically. Librarianship is the most subversive, excellent profession. And I started digging into our archives, I started looking around, and then I started talking to my own community. And I realized that my perspective that I'd had of going, okay, am I allowed in here? So many of my community, especially like trans and gender diverse people around, people of a younger age, were like, oh, I can't go there, it's a bit scary. I had a community event, particularly very early on in my employment here. I was chatting with people and there was a book that was being created. And I said, well, what are you guys going to do with this? Have you got an idea? And they said, oh, we'd love it to be somewhere where people can access it and, you know, somewhere safe, but we don't know where. I said, well, have you thought of the library? And they said, what? We're not special enough to be in there. Like, you know, would they accept it? Would it be good enough? And I'm like, none of us knew. And then that connection through as well that Margy was speaking to, of a lot of the collections that we have, this is the passion, the community, the integrated nature and the lived experiences of the people working here, of the different periods of time that we find ourselves in, of the different people who are our friends, our family, our lovers, our partners, our connections, and inviting us all to take up space here, inviting LGBTQ+ people to take up space, inviting everyone. This is the State Library of New South Wales, for the people of New South Wales, for the collections that represent all of our activities, our history, our people, what we look like, what we sound like. And so then, of course, yeah, I was hooked, and now I'm kind of on banners on Macquarie Street sometimes, apparently. Anyway.
That's awesome. That's great. Good for you. That's so great to hear. And I think it's really interesting because there's a lot of elements, it seems, that goes into making a space like the State Library of New South Wales feel so welcoming. Like, there's a lot of intentional efforts, and you're right about the history of like librarians and library spaces and archives being filled with queer people. It's quite a thing, and I've experienced it and I've benefited from it. So yay for that. But I think that there's also a lot of decisions that need to be made, and efforts as well, and ongoing kind of pushes to maybe shift the library's programming or library's ideas about what counts as queer collections along the way. Like, it's sort of developed over time, but some things have happened where people have been, you know, you've connected with people and told them about the library's ability to hold certain archives, and that's led people to sort of understand the library as a space that can accommodate certain archives. But there's other elements that come into it too, and I imagine there's been some, you know, need for a constant and intentional push over time to also expand the collection and expand what the library is willing to understand or able to understand as important in the archives. So I guess that takes me to a question about this library as a particularly notable space, powerful space for queer archives and queer collections and storytelling. And I'm wondering what you each think makes this library in particular particularly powerful, but also, you know, what goes into facilitating the State Library as a space for queer cultural preservation, given how the State Library does also contain a wide range of archives, and queer archives are unique, they're distinct, they tell specific stories, and sometimes these are controversial histories, provocative histories, but also important histories. Has there been a sort of tension in how you ensure that the library preserves and celebrates queer histories and queer archives, given that uniqueness of queer histories?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I made Bruce laugh when he was interviewing me because I talked about librarians needing to get out of their cardigans. It is a conservative profession, but it is also a generous one, with a self-consciousness about the importance of the work. So I think when someone like me and us comes along and is willing to work in these sort of what might be regarded as, slightly sensitive or difficult or problematic collecting areas, I never felt that any opposition or there was probably a sense of relief that I was willing to be very active and very visible and so on. So I haven't found it in anything I've done in other fields of representation of different kinds of diversity. I've never encountered any opposition or any feeling that this wasn't an appropriate area for the library to work in.
Want to add anything to that, Bruce or Sam?
Yeah, I would agree with that. In Pride Revolution, we talked about sex and all kinds of things, and I was thinking, oh my God, I wonder how some people in the building are going to deal with that. And it was actually totally fine, and people loved it. And I find if you just keep talking to people, you just got to keep talking to people and make yourself known and keep the conversation going. Like all of this stuff, I think history's a conversation. Then it's been fine for I've not come against any opposition or ill feeling or anything like that.
This is good to hear. Excellent.
Yeah.
Sam, do you want to add?
I'm the latest addition, but
Excellent.
But similarly, like I've even been very surprised. I thought there would at least be a little bit. Like I do some work I'm working in the reading rooms at the moment, but I've also done some work in acquisitions, and I still, similarly, I suppose, to my approach when I came in and realised that I was being scared for nothing. Kind of I've always expected more pushback than I've had, and I've found it very, at its core as well. Librarians, spaces like and humans, we all love stories. And as soon as something is translated into significance to a group, to a person, to a story, even if it's not your background or you don't agree with the underlying things, or it starts to become, someone can see the reason or the value. But yeah, no, I've always found it quite.
I think also, certainly in my experience of working in libraries, it's been really important that they're places where everybody's work is valued and everybody's contribution to building significant collections is valued. So, I mean, I've always wanted to be very democratic about that as I became more and more senior and manager. And, just to take it into some completely different areas, I've known people in this library and the National Library where I worked most recently who were cacti and rabbit enthusiasts. And I wanted them to make sure that, we had really good collections on cacti and rabbits. And, that's what it comes down to. If you know stuff, well, then be given the authority and the power to actually say, well, this should be acquired for the library. And that's very much how it works when you're talking about queer collecting,
like
as well as
the history of rabbits, or
cacti.
like the history of rabbits as pests, or like what were they? Bunny rabbits?
We've always got more
Bunny
questions.
rabbits, yeah.
Wow,
Breeding,
interesting.
anyway.
Fascinating. I might ask Bruce this to start with, but obviously for all the panellists, the queer collections and exhibitions here at the library have grown, obviously alongside some pretty major cultural and political shifts in our communities, particularly in the last 25 years alone. So I imagine collecting priorities, the funding available for such exhibitions, as well as things like the library's fellowships and the scope of topics encouragement, and as well as public engagement, has ebbed and flowed or risen and fallen in that time. And I just wondered if you could speak a bit to that, and how the kind of cultural landscape, as well as sort of shifts specifically affecting queer people and lives, have affected what's happening for the queer collections and the visibility of them in the library.
Yeah, I think that's very much true. I think, Royal Pride obviously was a pretty big moment, which, and we may not see something so huge and so queer again in Sydney for, I don't know, a while. But things do come and go, they do ebb and flow, and especially like talking, again, I can't escape this, but talking about HIV, like it was obvious that there was that archival impulse in the 80s and 90s when Margy was around and was that collecting was going on. And then there was probably a period where people were just getting on with their lives, new generations were coming up, new ways of seeing the way we love and all of that sort of thing, where, things were changing. And then it happens again. You get another wave. Yeah.
Thanks. Sam, do you have any thoughts about?
I mean, I have
Bullshit.
thoughts actually, like I'm reflecting as we go here now, deviating from any of the notes that I made. But interesting thinking in that wave kind of perspective, because I think we're at the start of another one. We're seeing trans and gender diverse rights being attacked all over the world. We're seeing legislation change. We're seeing the way our communities and our way we can engage and be change or be attacked or be enter this dialogue that is different from what's come past, but there's a lot of mirrored parts to previous gay liberation, to activism in the past. And I think I was reflecting on what we collect and why, and when we're, you know, are we contemporary? Are we currently collecting? Are we waiting until something's passed? What things are we collecting now on those topics? What things are we looking at, or what's going to represent that? What's going to tell us when we look back on this period of history, when hopefully it's not too horrendous as we go through it? But what role do we have in collecting those things or representing that? What is, if this is that next period that we're kind of stepping into in a different space, what stories will I be, you know, sitting down in another 20 years and speaking of that, my role in that? Or it's not really an answer so much as a, you know, yeah, direct from brain to mouth, you're welcome, kind of reflection here.
And what we do have is memory and all of the great archival material that we
Public
can...
banners with your face on it, apparently.
Yeah.
So we can look, they'll be like looking in the archives, be like,
But-
who is that?
Yeah, all this, you know, great archival material that we have that we can, you know, draw from to, you know, sustain us and to put up a fight.
And our existence, exactly, looking into the archives, and, you know, you can try and delete T from a memorial or something like that, but it's much harder to delete all of the materials that we have of our continued ongoing existence and representation in the, you know, 6, 7 stories below these buildings and across the world.
The other thing I'd just like to say is that we've talked a little bit about things like papers, but oral history is a really important part of the collecting that libraries like this one and the National Library do, and particularly for the more marginalised people and communities in our society. That's a really important way of capturing stories, memories, things that are happening and so forth. And because I'm such a fan of oral history, I couldn't go without let the opportunity of passing. But I could well see, and perhaps these are happening already, that there are oral history projects being done with trans people now, asking, as there have been other major oral history projects, recording their life histories and experiences.
There is actually a major, like a really great trans oral history project coming out of National Library of Derby Cars doing at the moment.
Yeah.
So with trans people, like, yeah, trans person and doing oral histories with trans people, it's really exciting.
Darby is a former SLNSW person, so that's amazing. That's good for Darby. That's great. Okay, so following on from Sam, or all of you kind of alluded to what's going on for the community now, what's happened in the past, but also looking to the future and thinking ahead to how we safeguard our histories, our stories, our voices. Queer communities have long memories. We have an amazing, generative, creative, dynamic history. And things like oral histories and other ways of collecting our stories is a way of ensuring these memories aren't dismissed. But also we've got to, you know, safeguard them and ensure that they're collected and protected and, shared appropriately in institutions, including libraries. So I'm wondering, like, what does the library still need to learn from queer communities about their archives and their stories, and how to collect and safeguard them, and also present them to the public? And is there still some relationship building between institutions like this library, libraries in general, and communities, so of minorities, of queer people, and building trust and some relationships there to ensure that the library is seen as a safe and appropriate space for their stories? Maybe let's start with Sam. You look like you want to say something.
Oh, I always want to say something. I mean, I think visibility is a really big part of that. You see someone that looks similar to you in a space it makes you more likely to go to that. It then makes the communities more likely to feel that that's a safe space they can be. And when it comes to archives and collecting things, it is about trust. It's not, you can't have a diverse collection without involvement with diverse communities. You can't have, people going, we want these diverse collections from communities around, but we don't have anyone that's engaged in that space. We don't have anyone that's in that community or part of that identity. It's those relationships and building those through the people that work here or that are engaged in this kind of space that I think is important to remember and to kind of keep working at, and that it's not necessarily like a institution versus community kind of thing. I mean, like, we are all part of our communities. My relationships, when I talk about, everyone knows us similarly probably to your friend Sophie. Everyone's like, yes, Sam, we know you like library and archives, yes. But I'm myself a queer trans person that's part of my family and community, chosen biological family here in Sydney first. And I am passionate about being a librarian, but that is my profession and I'm lucky enough to work here. But I am a queer trans person in my community first. I think there's a lot to look at that. We can't divide such a line necessarily, but thinking about how there have always been us involved in our lives that work here as well, and that interrelationship.
The things like events and exhibitions are incredibly important, public program activities and outreach, now of course increasingly online, and because I'm ancient, my career actually coincides with libraries becoming much more dynamic and visible rather than the sort of shushy places of the stereotypes. And I think that's really broken down a lot of the feelings of perhaps this is not my place. And it's something we always need to be conscious of. I mean, I'm always interested when I hear people like Sam or a group of young women the other day in Canberra talking about that their sense that the National Library wasn't a place for them or the State Library wasn't a place for them. And of course it doesn't feel like that on the inside, but it's really important that we who work in libraries remember that and are challenged by people who have uncertainties or reservation about what they'll find and how they'll be treated in libraries.
The National Library just needs its cafe back because it's like it was under it. Is the cafe back?
Yeah,
Do you know
it wasn't closed for very long.
Oh, well, okay, good, excellent.
Yeah, that's it.
Good to know. Yeah. Bruce, what about you?
Yeah, well, I think the work is never done, and we just have to keep talking to people and listening to people, and we're not always experts. And we need to also, this also speaks to who's employed in libraries, like, diversity in staff as well. And this is not just for queers, this is for other community groups as well, like a lot of migrant groups, different language groups. There's a lot of work to be done. It takes a long time of talking to people, trust is sometimes slow to build. You sometimes have to be told, prepared to go away and then try again later. But you try again later with people.
Sorry. And things take time. I mean, I was told recently that the papers of Sue Thompson have been acquired or are in the process of being acquired by the National Library. I was trying to think, when did I first go and visit Sue? Maybe 12 years ago. So the relationships sometimes have to be maintained over a very long period of time to find out what's going on in people's lives and to remind them of the library's continuing interest and so on and so forth. So it is a slow and sometimes difficult and complex process, as Bruce has said.
There are also at the same time these parallel organisations, and you all have kind of been a part of them, or particularly Sam and Bruce and me in Pride History Group, and places like the Australian Queer Archives in Melbourne, so community-based volunteer-run archival repositories for specifically queer collections that are endlessly, I think, overflowing. I think there's more interest and ability to deposit there than that we probably have space in these community archives, but they remain so integral and so generative and often inform and help the libraries bigger public institutions learn from their expert knowledge of those archives. So do you see that kind of role of those community archives still being very strong in leading the kind of queer archival practice, I guess, or how to kind of, they need to be there and perhaps are the better spaces in some ways as well for these collections?
Well, the community-based collections and the national and state libraries each have their place, and there's too much stuff to be worried about where it goes. It needs to go to the right place, and it needs to go to a place. And people will have views about whether a state library or a community archive is the right place for them. I've often told staff that the papers and the things that represent a person's life, there are terrible words in archival theory about taking records into custody. And, I've seen people going through the papers of someone they'd loved, and they take them out of an archives box in a reading room and they might stroke them as if they were touching a person. We have to treat papers with respect, and we have to treat them as for what they are. They are the remnants of someone's life and experience. But, there are some things that a state or national library could never agree to. So I've been asked by lesbians whether men will be able to have access to their papers if they put them in a state or national library. I can't say no, because, that is not something a state-funded institution can do. So, of course, someone who feels that they don't ever want their papers to be used by men will feel more that it would be better if they were in a community space, and that's fine. Equally, there will be some things that wouldn't be, I think, collected by a community archive. It would be very hard to find the records of, lesbian women who are trans exclusionary, I should imagine, in Aqua. How could they? So what we all need to be conscious of is that we're all doing the same work. It's important. And I'll shut up because I know Bruce and I share a view about that state-funded institutions have to do things that community institutions also do and represent. They can't be let off the hook.
Yeah, look, I think actually there's a few questions from the audience that dovetail quite nicely with what Margy's just been saying, and also just thinking about new directions for the library and its collections and the visibility of queer lives here at the library. So we might turn to some audience questions. There's many, which is awesome. Thank you. And I remembered the passcode for this iPad, so that's awesome. Someone asked a great question. What are the key things missing in the collection? And this is something I was interested to ask each of you about. The gaps, the sort of more difficult, complicated things that we want to see in the library to tell the story of queer lives and all their complexities, but don't yet have or aren't sure how to present. Sam?
Sure. One of our major gaps, I might be biased here, but representation of trans and gender diverse communities and people. We do have that, it does exist. But again, become of that visibility or because of access or people or organisation of records and things, I think that's something that I'd really like to in my career kind of look to and work to. I suppose, again, my own identity and connection with that. We do what we know and we love. And I think a lot of the intersectional communities as well, a lot of that, our records are from historical collections, access to places like this, privilege are skewed towards white organisations and groups from, circumstances, from privilege, from access. I think we working into those intersections in our communities, into our First Nations collections, into our migrant and, people, basically not white people as well, in having a full spectrum of all of our intersectional identities into a disability overlaps, and I think just a lot of those parts that aren't the loudest voice sometimes, or don't have the platform to speak, or haven't been given a platform to speak, that you might have to go looking for a bit more. I think that's a really important gap that at least I'd like to look at for the future steps here.
Well, thank you, Sam. And one of our audience members was asking specifically about those gaps for people with disability in their lives and experiences, so, and how that will be, and if there are hopes to include more of those stories in the archive. So that's, yeah, thanks for sharing that. Those kind of intentions around expanding the collection.
I mean, that's my intention.
Yeah,
That's,
well,
this is
forth.
very much me, like, yes, I'm a librarian, like.
Bruce, what about you? Gaps and things missing? What are we needing to include?
Yeah, well, I agree with Sam. I think there's a whole lot of people that from non-English, from non-Anglo-Celtic backgrounds that we lack a little bit. The collections are pretty white in a lot of ways. We did an oral history project in the last couple of years. Myself and my colleague Anne Hocking worked on that, and we managed to collect 60 oral histories, and I think about 45% of those are with people from non-English speaking background. We were very conscious of that, and it'd be good to see more of that, and especially the same with, of course, disability and trans. I mean, there's just so many people. Again, it's that whole thing of who's working here, who you meet, who you talk to, getting these conversations
who
going.
Trusts you and who you trust.
That's right.
Very big.
That's right.
And
there's lots of work to be done.
And the readers are also really important. Sorry, that's the term I use. I've been using it for decades. But researchers, the people who use libraries, it's not all down to the staff. That having the relationships with people who come in and use libraries is also how you find out what's not there, what's out there, and so forth. It's the engagement of people with collections that is so good about libraries, and so important, and also leads to building new collections and following leads and thinking of new things.
Speaking of gaps, I know that something that's been really addressed consciously over many years, and it's increasing, and something I've noticed especially as a historian of lesbian and queer women in Australia, gaps in the record, or sort of maybe less obvious visibility around women's stories, or kind of representing sort of the minorities within minorities. And someone asked a question about the kind of historical gaps or overlooking of women's stories in the archive, or lesbian stories specifically. I know that that's definitely my area, and I agree with the question. But also it was something that I found really amazing about the library, is the celebration of doing that history, of researching the history of lesbian Australia, lesbian politics and activism in Sydney and New South Wales. And I was given a lot of money in a fellowship to do that research, which was amazing. And if Francis is here, shout out Francis for depositing a amazing collection. Hi. Francis runs a collection of the ephemera and materials, and just immense copy of Loddle, the amazing effort that went into producing such a key magazine for lesbians, a cultural kind of key piece of lesbian culture in Australia with Barb Farrelly. It's without that deposit, without me being able to access it, I would not have been able to do such amazing, interesting, and very popular, very important work that has had a lot of interest and has connected me to a lot of other sort of histories and stories as a result. So without that celebration of lesbian history, or ability to willingness to support it at this library, I wouldn't have had such wouldn't have gone down that track. So there is definitely changes in the lesbian visibility within the archives, but I wonder if that's something you can speak to about. Are we noticing still some sort of gender disparities, or some overlooking still in particular of women's stories, as we have in the kind of trajectory of LGBTQ history and activism?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that women generally are often underrepresented in these kinds of collections, so not by any means limited to lesbian women. So it does require effort. I mean, as recently as 1999, this is another rabbit and cactus story, but the National Library was making it a priority to collect records relating to economists. Australia punches above its weight in economic thinking, believe it or not. I was presented with a list of distinguished economists whose papers who were going to be sought about placing their papers in their library, and there was not a single woman on it in 1999. So eternal vigilance is needed. The other thing is, of course, we see things differently and we read things differently at different points in time. And of course, as Sophie will well know, there's lesbian material in the collection from history that wouldn't have been, conveniently given a subject heading Lesbians Australia. You really do have to read against the grain and interpret against the grain.
Close friends, yes.
Yes, close
intimate
friends,
acquaintances.
lifelong companions.
Any other points? Anything else to add?
I mean, I suppose only on that point of reading in, that, like what Bruce said before, that history is conversation, that not just in what are we acquiring, both like retrospectively as well as contemporary and, proactively, but the role of researchers, the role of people using the collections and finding the stories in there. There is a lot of material. Sometimes it's tucked away into other archives of different stories that you wouldn't assume there is. There's things to be discovered. There's, as you would know from your research, reading, sometimes unfortunately we have to read between the lines, but sometimes people will uncover something in an archive that when we now view it with this lens, or when a specific researcher is looking for this thread, actually does find we do have the evidence. It is really often down to we are the repository of these things, but actually finding the stories in it, it's very much a dynamic that we rely, institutions rely, and the collections rely on the people digging into it as well to recontextualize those stories, look at it from a different lens, find that evidence that we wouldn't when you quickly do an acquisition and catalogue it and pop it in. Those stories, there's so many that are still hidden in there.
It's interesting because I had the opposite, not problem, but the challenge for me was a lot of my research on lesbians in Australia and their communities over time was post-1970s. So the word lesbian was very explicit, as was dyke, as was, it was named and claimed. This was very visible. And I think for me, I was leading up to doing that project here at the State Library thinking, I'm going to be saying lesbian a lot in front of readers and people, hearing about this research. And there was it was a silly thing to worry about because it was so embraced and it was so, wonderfully received and such important work. But I think it's, it felt like a bit of a new thing too as well for the library at that time. But, I was totally supported. We have time for one more question. And this is a personal question about each of you and your archival practices in your personal life. Wait, where did it go? It was something about you being, okay, where is it? It was a great one. Here we go. As professional, whoever asked this, good for you. As professional collectors or people responsible for documenting queer history, are you hoarders in your personal lives?
It's a great question. I came with a bag of things to give to Bruce, ephemera and publications, not from my collection, but every time I've moved, I've given particularly ephemeral publications and things to the appropriate library. I've got a clause in my will that my papers are not to go, any remaining papers are not to go into a library.
It's not very on brand for tonight. Jesus.
No, I've done 2 oral history interviews. It was with the greatest pleasure that I tucked out all my appointment diaries and annual reports for the State Library of New South Wales after I'd been interviewed by Bruce, and I've done the same for the period of the National Library. There is too much stuff and the libraries don't need mine. I've done my work and I've told the tale in oral histories, and that's enough for me. But, don't do as I do as I say.
Bruce, what does your house look like?
Yeah, I do collect, and I live in a small 1-bedroom apartment, so it's a constant challenge.
I married someone who's not a researcher or an academic or an archivist, so I'm not allowed to have anything in my house. So it's sort of like maybe I've got 1 tote bag of things now. The rest is all scanned and online, sadly. Sam, what about you?
Yeah, look, I moved enough in my 20s that I couldn't keep carrying everything all the time. So there's a bit of a benefit in that. And also my mum, who is here today, going, I'm not moving this many books every time you were going somewhere. But now I'm old enough to afford removalists. So you better believe my library is very well catalogued. I've got an app for that. I've also got an app for the way I keep all my notes that is bidirectionally linked so I can associatively manage my ADHD. While I don't have a lot of paper files, because again, see, I'm coming in this digital shift over, as a millennial, I kind of went, all right, yeah, I can scan this in, and do I need this anymore? But my files are both really, really organized with very, very solid kind of hierarchy of things, and also an absolute nightmare when my ADHD is, wars over the autism. And my photo library is the worst thing that any photographer would ever have a look at, and I am too scared to even look at it, so I suppose I'll just collect millions of photos until the end of the day.
Yeah, I feel like you're a hoarder. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that was a lot of words to say, yeah. I'm a hoarder, but I work really hard on it not being.
Okay, good for you. Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight and for coming and joining and listening to these three wonderful speakers and their amazing insights. I really enjoyed listening to each of you. Thank you for all your efforts with the library, even you, Margy, even though you don't want to leave any of your own archives here. You've done a lot for the place, so that's awesome. Please thank our three wonderful guests.